Hey everyone, I'm starting another journey and this time it's with C#. I've set a goal for myself to find 3 good C# books. Since I already have some knowledge and experience with this language, I'm not a complete beginner, but I'll do my best to evaluate how well the material is taught, walk you through the pros and cons of each chapter, and then give you my overall verdict on whether the book is actually worth your time. For me, learning C# is part of getting ready to become a Unity developer. I recently started learning the Unity engine alongside this, and you need to write C# code there. I also want to brush up on my skills, learn some new things, lock everything down, and start preparing C# tutorials for you guys here on my channel. So let's get started. The first book I picked is the C# Player's Guide, 5th edition from 2022. Depending on when you're watching this, the 6th edition, or even a newer one, might already be out. This particular edition covers C# 10 and .NET 6, so as of 2026, it's not exactly a brand new book. But the thing is, C# and the .NET platform get updated every single year, which is why newer books get outdated so quickly. The good news, though, is that while every new version adds something new, the old stuff still works and serves as the core foundation. So don't be afraid to grab books that don't cover the absolute latest version of the language. 99% of the code you'll actually write relies on the core fundamentals of C# that were established years ago. Let's dive in. Introduction. In the introduction, the author talks about programming in general and compares it to a game, giving a bunch of examples of why programming can feel like playing a game and why it can be so fun and engaging. Then he explains that the book itself is actually structured like a game. Basically, you get XP, experience points, for completing chapters and doing the exercises. Of course, in reality, XP doesn't give you anything in real life, but it can give you a nice sense of satisfaction. The book even features a drawn map that shows all the chapters you will be going through. There are a lot of chapters here, 53 plus 3 expansions, and they aren't even called chapters but levels. Still, the book isn't huge, it's under 500 pages, which means the chapters will be super quick reads, but I'm hoping the information in them will be pretty dense and complete. Level 1. The C# programming language. The first chapter is purely informational. You won't write a single line of code or install anything. You'll just learn what C# actually is. The author goes over its advantages and capabilities, showing how you can build all kinds of different things with this language. He also touches on what .NET and the BCL, base class library, are, but only on a surface level. There's nothing complicated here. Level 2. Getting an IDE. In this chapter, the author explains what an IDE is and why we need to use one, as well as what options are available on the market, though the main focus is on Visual Studio. The author breaks down its different versions. In the book, we'll be installing the 2022 version. Even though the 2026 version is out now, they are virtually identical. He then walks us through a simplified installation guide for Visual Studio. After that, I'm guessing we'll actually start writing some code in the next chapter. Level 3. Hello World, your first program. In this chapter, we finally start writing actual code. First, we learn how to create a project, and the author gives a great visual guide explaining what a project and a solution are. After that, we get to see the editor, learn what the console is and looks like, and figure out how to compile and run our programs quickly before jumping straight into the code. We start specifically with literals, and only one in particular, the string literal, which is right there in front of us since creating a project automatically outputs hello world. Next, we run through concepts like identifiers, classes, methods, and namespaces, and we brush up on the base class library again. Then we break down the difference between statements and expressions, learn how to call console readline and console writeline multiple times, and get the hang of variables, including how to store and read values. But so far, everything is pretty surface level. There are a lot of concepts thrown into a single pile. For example, in my own lessons, I prefer to cover the basic data types in one video, then talk about the values used for those types in the next, and only after that explain variables, how to create them, change them, reassign them, and read them. Still, for now, it's pretty straightforward because there isn't too much info and it's easy to remember. However, starting right here, I'm noticing a specific issue that pops up quite a bit throughout the book. The author often gives us exercises to reinforce the material, which is great, but all the exercises follow this specific structure where the author first tells a story tied to our journey through the book. It's like we've landed on a deserted island and we're talking to the locals, doing quests for them, saving people and so on. And all of this is just set up for very simple tasks. The problem is that the story text is just way too long. You spent all this time reading it just to find out at the end that all you need to do is print a single line of text to the screen. While it might not bother you right now, a few chapters in, you'll find yourself wanting to just get to the exercises already instead of reading lore that has nothing to do with the actual tasks. Level 4. Comments. In this short chapter, the author explains what comments are, shows 2 ways to use them, and gives some tips on how to write good comments. But the thing is, we've only just started learning the language and haven't really written enough complex code yet to get a feel for where comments are actually needed and where they aren't. Because of that, his advice feels a bit abstract and impractical right now. But maybe, as we get into more complex code later in the book, he'll write comments that are a lot more useful to us. Level 5. Variables. Now, this is a good chapter. Here, everything is focused entirely on variables. The author explains how to create them, how to initialize them, and how to change their values. He also introduces another data type besides string, specifically the int data type. I don't quite get why he didn't cover all the other data types and only showed int. It's like he explained that there are many data types out there, but only actually showed us how to use int. Either way, after this chapter, we'll have a much better grasp on what variables are and how to use them, the naming rules for variables in the language, and some solid tips on how to name them properly. Level 6. The C# type system. I really liked this chapter too, because the author goes all over all the standard data types we'll be using throughout the book and that you'll run into all the time in programming. This includes regular integer types, floating point types, the boolean bool type, the character char type, and the string type. It also breaks down the concept of literals, the convert class, and the parse method in data types. Because of that, after this chapter, you'll have a much better understanding of why we actually need data types. Unfortunately, though, there were very few hands-on exercises, and they were pretty boring. I'm hoping the upcoming chapters will make up for this. Level 7. Math. This chapter doesn't focus on math itself, but rather starts with mathematical operators like addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and modulo, remainder. It also covers parentheses, with the author explaining how they increase priority in different mathematical formulas. We'll also break down the assignment operator. After that, we'll learn that every data type has its own properties, like min value or max value, and that floating point numbers also have positive and negative infinities, as well as the concept of nan, not a number. The author also explains what happens when you divide a number by 0. On top of that, the modulo operator is explained in detail, after which we get a super basic, simple task. Next, we cover increments and decrements in both of their forms, prefix and postfix. After that, we break down explicit and implicit typecasting, with the author showing plenty of examples of where to use it and where it happens automatically. Finally, we get introduced to classes like math and mathf for working with math. The author shows us the Euler's number, E, and pi constants, along with sine, cosine, minimum, maximum, and the clamp method. And that's pretty much it. So far, everything is easy, though I definitely like to see more exercises. At least, the author explains things in a way that's easy to grasp, and there isn't too much information packed into each chapter. Level 8. Console 2.0. Here, the author keeps telling us about the different tools under the console class, like changing the console's background and text colors, playing console sounds, the write method, and how it differs from write line. After that, we learn a bit more about how strings work, specifically what escape sequences are, though the author doesn't show all of them, string interpolation, and how to format strings, like adjusting their width or formatting numbers to show percentages, a specific number of decimal places, and so on. Even though the chapter is still simple and straightforward, I don't really like how we're covering so many tools that we don't actually understand yet. For example, we don't even know what classes, methods, enums, or properties are, but the author uses them constantly. I get that each of these concepts will have its own dedicated chapter later on, and right now we're just learning how to use the tools rather than understanding how they work under the hood. I'm not a big fan of his teaching style, but at least there's nothing too complicated for now, and everything makes sense so far. Level 9. Decision making. And now we're finally getting to programs where we'll be writing conditions and running code based on how those conditions turn out. In this chapter, we break down the if statement and the ternary operator. The author does an awesome job going through all the possible variations of this statement, showing tons of examples and giving great tips on how to use it. No complaints here whatsoever. Everything is solid. The only minor thing you could nitpick is the chapter's title. In the very next chapter, he's going to cover the switch statement, which easily could have fit under the same heading, but he decided to give the switch statement its own separate chapter instead. Level 10. Switches. In this chapter, the author goes over switch expressions and switch statements. It's a really short chapter, which is why I said it probably would have been better to bundle it with the previous one. I think in Chapter 40, he actually comes back to the switch to talk about pattern matching. But honestly, I wasn't a huge fan of the explanation here. First off, he didn't really explain why we should even use a switch in the first place, or what makes it better than an if statement. He also gave way too few examples of how to actually use it. If I were a first-time reader, I'd probably be left wondering, okay, but why do I even need this? Level 11. Looping. In this chapter, the author covers the while, do while, and for loops, the concept of nested loops, and keywords like break and continue. And here, we run into a few minor issues again. First off, even though the author did a decent job explaining everything, he didn't really explain where you'd actually use a do-while loop, meaning there wasn't a solid, real-world example. I get that it's a rare loop that doesn't get used very often, but since he decided to include it, he should have either shown a good example or just said what I just said and given a basic one. Also, he crammed both break and continue into a single example, which made the whole thing feel pretty bloated and forced rather than practical and realistic. I would have preferred separate, clean examples for each of those keywords. On top of that, he completely skipped range-based for loops and didn't mention anywhere that he'd be covering them later. Because of that, the chapter feels a bit incomplete. Level 12. Arrays. In this chapter, the author covers all three types of arrays: single-dimensional, jagged, and multidimensional arrays. But once again, he doesn't really show any good real-world examples of how to use jagged or multidimensional arrays. Also, this chapter desperately needs more exercises. I'm starting to realize that the author just threw the exercises in here to check a box. Even though he clearly put a lot of effort into writing this interesting backstories for them, he would have been much better off cutting the lore entirely and focusing on giving us a wider variety of tasks. And finally, he also introduces the for each loop here, the fourth and final loop in C#. Of course, he doesn't break it down completely because you need to know a lot more about C# to fully understand how it works under the hood. And honestly, I highly doubt he'll ever circle back to explain this loop later on. Level 13, Methods. Here, the author explains what a method is, how a method differs from a function by definition, and what a local function is. Then he shows how to create methods, pass parameters to them, return values, and call them. He also covers method overloading and recursion, and that's about it. Obviously, this is far from a complete breakdown of methods. While everything the author shows is still an easy read, which is definitely a plus for this book, as almost every single chapter is highly accessible, it doesn't give you the full picture. The examples for many of these concepts are way too simplified and don't give the reader enough context to understand where to actually apply them. Take recursion, for example. The author explains what it is and shows the most cliché example possible, calculating a factorial, and that's it. A single, solitary example that 99% of readers will probably never use in real life. The second issue is that the author uses top-level statements in the project settings. Because of this, the methods aren't being created inside classes. Even though he mentions that we'll be writing methods inside classes later on, right now they are all being created inside the main method, meaning we're essentially just writing local functions. Honestly, it's a bit confusing. I really dislike top-level statements, and I strongly believe that beginners should be taught with this feature turned off. Beginners need to understand that in C#, everything is built on how classes interact with one another. Consequently, they need to know from day one that there is a base class, that the main method lives inside it, and so on. Level 14, Memory Management. Now, this is a great chapter. Here we finally learn what value types and reference types are, the differences between them, and also how the stack and the heap memory works and differ from each other. The author does a great job using visual code examples to show how values are stored in the stack, what exactly gets written there, how the stack operates under the hood, and why it exists in the first place. After that, he shows how dynamic memory, the heap, works. Thanks to this, we finally get why string and arrays are reference types, while all the other types we've covered so far are value types. It's a bit of a bummer that there's only one exercise, but at least it's a good one. We also get introduced to the garbage collector with a basic high-level overview. The author doesn't dive into the nitty-gritty details, but honestly, beginners don't really need that right now anyway. Level 15, Object-Oriented Concepts. This marks the beginning of the second part of the book, which focuses on object-oriented programming, and this chapter serves as the introduction. It explains what OOP actually is and covers its general concept without diving into encapsulation, polymorphism, inheritance, or abstraction just yet. It simply explains the overall concept and why it's so much better than traditional procedural programming. Starting with the next few chapters, we'll actually get into the specific types we can use in object-oriented programming and beyond. Level 16, Enumerations. This chapter covers the enum data type, so you'll learn how to create them, declare enum variables, assign values to them, and use those values. But I was really surprised that there wasn't a single decent real-world example of how to use them. The author did a great job explaining why we need enums, but for some reason he chose not to show a classic use case, like pairing them with a switch statement. It's just bizarre. He didn't even give us a single exercise to wrap our heads around the material. Level 17, Tuples. This chapter is all about tuples. The author explains what they are, how to create them, how to name tuple variables, how to copy them, how to extract values from a tuple, and how to pass them to and return them from functions. As a somewhat experienced developer, a question popped up for me. Why do we even need tuples if we have structs? I eventually found the answer to this, but not in this chapter. And of course, beginners don't even know what a struct is at this point. But once they do find out and look back at tuples, they'll probably wonder, why bother with tuples when structs seem much simpler and cleaner for passing to and returning from functions? The author doesn't answer this question, which is something I really wish he had done. Either way, there's nothing complicated about tuples, but the author definitely didn't give us the full picture. He doesn't explain the actual data type that powers tuples, mostly because there are still so many C# concepts we haven't covered yet. And for some reason, I doubt he'll ever circle back to explain it. Level 18. Classes. And this is where things really start to shift, because we're finally diving into what a class is. The author explains it on a conceptual level, breaking down what an object and an instance actually are, how to create classes, how to instantiate them, how to write constructors, how to call one constructor from another, how to set default values for fields, and how to delegate constructors. He also explains that if you don't write any constructors yourself, the class will automatically generate its own default constructor, and he highlights the difference between the two. On top of that, he shows how we can use methods and fields in our class, how to call them, and how to change those field values. Finally, he introduces the first pillar of OOP, encapsulation. In his view, encapsulation is bundling fields and methods together into a single entity called a class. Personally, I agree with him, but I also feel like this definition should include protecting these class members using access modifiers. As it turns out, he actually covers access modifiers in the very next chapter, which means he probably treats these two concepts as separate things. So let's move on to the next chapter. Level 19, Information Hiding. In this chapter, the author explains access modifiers such as public, private, and internal. He most likely left the protected access modifier for later. When it comes to the private access modifier, he explained everything very well. He explained where it is better to use it and why it should be used. He also explained the internal access modifier well, but he didn't provide any real-world examples of when to use it, so I had to look for the answer separately. Specifically, I had to figure out when you should explicitly write internal and when you should use public for a class. Overall, this was also not a difficult chapter. Level 20, Properties. In this chapter, the author will talk about properties, what they are, how to create them, what shortcuts exist for properties, how to set a private setter, what the init keyword does in a property, and how to use an initializer list when creating an object through properties. I had a question here. Why do properties look like they violate encapsulation? Because all the examples the author showed in this chapter seem like they break encapsulation. This raises another question. Why not just make the field public instead of creating properties for it? Because of this, I started looking for the answer on my own online. I found it. However, I think the author should have explained this as well, because programmers need to develop a sense of when they should implement properties and when they shouldn't. I didn't understand that from this chapter. Level 21, Static. Here, the author explains that with a static keyword, we can create static fields, static properties, static methods, static constructors, and even static classes. He also shows many examples of how to use them, but they are quite basic and unrealistic. Because of this, it becomes another downside of this book. There are no good real-world examples of using these features. Yes, the author mentions classes like console, math, and convert. All of them are static, but he could have created at least one more or less realistic example of a static class. Anyway, a huge advantage of this book is that everything is still very easy to read and understand. Level 23, Object-Oriented Design. When we write large projects using object-oriented programming, we need to understand which classes will exist in our project, what fields, methods, and properties they will have, and also how these classes will interact with each other. In this chapter, the author tries to explain how we can think through the design all of this. At first, I felt like this chapter had too much filler and not enough specific information. However, later, the author improves and uses an asteroid game as an example to explain several different ways of designing a project. Honestly, I think this chapter is not very useful at this stage, because before beginners can really improve their project design skills, they need to complete many different tasks where they will naturally and unconsciously practice this kind of design, but only on a very, very basic level. This level should gradually be increased over time by giving them more and more complex tasks. Since this book doesn't include those kinds of exercises, the value of this chapter is not as high as it could have been if the book contained a much larger number of practical tasks. Level 24, the Catacombs of the class. This chapter finally gives us what was missing from all the previous chapters. Several interesting and large coding tasks focused on writing code in an OOP style and improving our ability to analyze the architecture of our projects. There is no theory here, only exercises. I wish every previous chapter had also included several tasks, at least 5 to 10 each. In that case, the book would have felt much better. Level 25, Inheritance. And here we have the second main OOP paradigm, Inheritance, which is already the author's fourth one. I think I somehow missed the third one. The author explains it well. You will get introduced to the object class and its methods, learn how to create child classes, understand why we use inheritance in the first place, get familiar with the protected access modifier and the sealed keyword, and understand the concept of downcasting and how the is and as operators work. Inheritance is an interesting concept, but why only one task to practice it? Inheritance opens the door to much more complex abstractions in programming, which means you can come up with many absurd, simple, or interesting tasks to help reinforce this concept. Level 26, Polymorphism. Here, the author talks about subtype polymorphism. First of all, polymorphism is a much broader concept than just subtype polymorphism. For example, in the C# language, there are generics, which can also be considered a form of polymorphism. There is also method overloading, which can also be classified as polymorphism. And the third one is subtype polymorphism, which is what the author is going to explain here. Basically, it is about overriding a method in a child class, giving a new behavior, and then choosing the correct method through a reference to the base class. Everything was clear to me here, and the author even explained well why polymorphism is needed. He also provided good exercises for practicing its implementation, so I don't have any questions about this chapter. Everything is explained well. However, personally, I would also like to know how polymorphism works internally, because as a C++ developer, I know that technical interviews often ask how subtype polymorphism is implemented internally in C++. It is possible that this question is also asked for C#. Level 27, Interfaces. Here, you will learn how to create interfaces, what the difference is between an interface and an abstract class, where to use interfaces, unfortunately, only through one example with levels. And you will also learn about the new feature of implementing default methods in interfaces. The chapter is quite short, and honestly, interfaces are a very architectural concept in the C# language. To better understand where to use them, you need to use a large number of examples, including examples from the standard library. Unfortunately, the author never explained where interfaces are used in the standard library, even though he could have shown some examples since we are already working with them. Level 28, Structs. Here, the author explains what structs are, how to create them, what specific behaviors they have, and how they differ from classes. I was glad that the author was able to provide some recommendations on when to use structs, because this might make it easier for readers to decide in the future what to choose, a struct or a class. However, this is still not the complete picture, because there are also the in, ref, and out modifiers, which make the choice between structs and classes more complicated. But there hasn't been a single word about them yet, so we just continue reading. Level 29, Records. Another short chapter that explains what records are. As I understand it, they are basically synthetic sugar that gets transformed into either a struct with some methods or a class with some methods. The author shows a few simple examples of how to use them, and then briefly explains where to use records, where to use tuples instead, and where to use records instead of tuples. And that's it. Honestly, I still had questions about where exactly to use them in real-world examples. Because of that, I immediately went to ask an AI about it afterward. So even though this is a completely new topic for me because the C++ language doesn't have records, I still feel like the author didn't really explain what they are properly. The text itself is easy to read, but the concept of records still feels kind of strange. I still haven't really felt their place or purpose in the C# language. Level 30, Generics. I liked this chapter because everything in it was simple. The author explained why we need generics and showed how to create generic classes and methods. After that, he showed different tricks for using them. Maybe not all of them, though. As an experienced C++ developer, I know that C++ has templates, which serve a similar purpose to generics in C#. However, templates are a huge topic, and understanding everything about them can be extremely difficult. But I don't know if the author provided enough information about generics. I would say it is probably enough for beginners, that's for sure. By the way, this chapter also covers the default operator in the context of generics. Level 31, the Fountain of Objects. This is another practical chapter where you first have to build a game and then improve it by adding 5 more tasks. I really like this approach because out of all the exercises, this one will require you to write the largest amount of code and, more importantly, use many OOP concepts and mechanisms. The author deserves special praise for this. The tasks are interesting, moderately challenging, and very useful. I highly recommend them. Level 32. Some useful types. Here, the author briefly goes over the following topics: creating a random number using the random class, storing a specific date using the datetime structure, storing a timed interval using timespan, getting a unique identifier number using GUID, explaining the list and dictionary collections, explaining the IEnumerable interface and IEnumerator, explaining the nullable structure, explaining what the actual underlying type inside tuples is, and the difference between string and string builder. There are a lot of topics here. The information is easy and clear to understand. However, there are a few small problems. For example, when you learn how to generate random numbers, it opens up many possibilities for tasks related to random number generation, and the author could have provided some exercises for readers, but he didn't. Also, C# has many different collections. I would have liked the author to explain each of them in this book, talk about their advantages and disadvantages compared to each other, and ideally explain their big O notation as well. But that is also missing here. The same situation applies to interfaces. There are many more interfaces in C#. Why not explain at least 5 of them? And finally, the author didn't explain when to use string instead of string builder. He showed that string builder solves an important optimization problem, but then why would we ever use string? Level 33, managing larger programs. The third part of the book has started, where more advanced topics will be covered. We'll see how it goes. The first topic is a complete breakdown of namespaces. There is nothing to complain about here. Everything is clear. The author will also briefly show how to create type aliases and explain what top-level statements are, which we have already been using for 33 chapters. Unfortunately, he didn't explain why they were introduced or where they are actually useful. Level 34, Methods Revisited. Here, the author returns to the topic of methods and adds 2 more things to our knowledge: the in-out ref modifiers for parameters and extension methods. The second topic was explained very poorly. You will often encounter these kinds of methods, so I would have liked the author to at least show where they are already used. Instead, he only showed one example of creating such a method, and that was it. When the author first explained methods, I hoped that these topics would be covered later in the book, and I'm glad they actually appeared. Level 35, Error Handling and Exceptions. Here, the author explains quite well what exceptions are. You will learn how to throw them, how to catch them, how to handle them, how to use the finally block, how to rethrow exceptions further along the chain of methods, and what to do with the members of an exception class. You will also learn about the hierarchy of standard exceptions, but this information is not complete, even though the author covered the most common exceptions. You will also get many useful tips on how to use exceptions. A great chapter where the author didn't leave anything important out. Level 36. Delegates. Here, the author quickly explains what a delegate is, how to create one, how to call methods through it, and how to subscribe and unsubscribe methods. And unfortunately, that's it. There is no explanation about memory leaks, calling a list of delegates, and or more practical examples of using delegates instead of the simplest and most basic ones. As an experienced C++ programmer, I know that delegates are basically similar to function pointers, so I understand where they can be used in practice, for example, in UI architecture, but a beginner will not know that. Level 37. Events. Events are a continuation of the topic of delegates because they are closely related. The author will show how to create events, how to attach and detach delegates to events, and will also demonstrate different ways of working with events, for example, event handler. But honestly, I still don't fully understand the purpose of events in C#. To improve understanding, there are 2 exercises at the end of the chapter that help with the problem at least a little. Level 38. Lambda expressions. This chapter was a bit simpler, but I don't like the fact that throughout the entire third part of the book, the author provides very few examples and they are not always practical. The same situation happens here. This is a short chapter with short examples where you will learn how to create lambdas and assign them to delegates. The author goes through the entire syntax in detail and explains exactly how capturing variables outside of a lambda works. However, the author didn't mention one new feature. Since C# 10.0, lambdas can also be stored in var variables. Level 39. Files. Here, the author explains what serialization is, how to write information to files, how to read it from files, how to create files and folders, and how to work with streams at a basic level. There is not much information about streams. The author also shows one example of how to write and read a record with 3 fields into a CSV file. However, I would have liked to see many more examples and especially more exercises, because working with files is a whole new area for practice, especially in game development, saving game progress, leaderboards, creating a phone book, and so on. Level 40. Pattern matching. An interesting topic because it includes both popular features and extremely niche ones. The author will talk about constant pattern and discard pattern, type and declaration patterns, case guards, property pattern, nested patterns, relational patterns, and or and not patterns, the positional pattern, deconstructors, var pattern, parenthesized patterns, and patterns in switch statements. The chapter seems relatively short, but the amount of different syntax here is huge. Because of that, after finishing it, I had already forgotten half of what I had read. I hope that in the future, I will actually encounter at least some of these features in real code, because it feels like many of them were created for very specific and rare situations. Level 41. Operator overloading. Another small chapter that explains how to overload operators so they can be used with custom data types. Everything is clear and not even difficult. The examples are useful, and there are also many exercises, which is always a good thing. I have no complaints about this chapter at all. An excellent chapter. Level 42. Query expressions. Here the author explains what LINQ is and introduces us to creating different queries for collections using clauses such as from, select, into, let, order by, and others. I don't like the way the material is presented here. The problem is that the author focuses on explaining all possible clauses using only one example with game objects, while the actual execution of queries is only shown at the end of the chapter. There should be more diverse, possibly even complete, and preferably practical examples. It is good that there are at least a few exercises at the end of the chapter. Level 43. Threads. Here, only the basics are covered. We will understand what multi-threading is, how to run a separate thread, and We will also learn about data races and mutexes, and that's it. There are very few useful real-world examples of using multithreading. Also, at the end, the author says that you should avoid multithreading, which sounds very strange and out of place. There is only one exercise here, and it is not practical. I already know from C++ that multithreading is a difficult and broad area of programming, and mastering it requires more than just a few pages of text. But this is not the end. There is another chapter. Level 44. Asynchronous programming. This is probably the hardest chapter for me. It was a completely new topic, and after reading the chapter, I honestly didn't understand what I had just read. I didn't really understand the difference between multithreading and asynchronous programming. I didn't understand how the await and async keywords work or where to use them. The author explained everything terribly, although maybe I'm the problem, because I tried asking an AI about it afterward, and it generated a lecture that was no less difficult to understand. I'm not going to give up, and I'll start looking for answers in other places, but here the author created such a mess that it felt like someone else wrote this chapter, because up until this point, all the previous chapters had been clear. Level 45, Dynamic Objects. This is an interesting chapter that explains how to create objects that can change their type at runtime. The author shows how to create and use them, how to implement them using a dictionary with strings, how to add, remove, and access methods and fields in these objects, and even how to inherit from building classes to create your own dynamic objects. But in my opinion, the chapter is missing the most important thing, an explanation of why we would ever need this. For 44 chapters, we have been using static types. Now dynamic types suddenly appear, but the author doesn't provide any real-world examples of where they are actually used. As a result, the obvious question is, why do I even need to know this? Level 46, Unsafe Code. This is an interesting chapter because it takes us into the world of pointers, unsafe code, and topics such as the size of fixed okay, let's again. So this is an interesting chapter because it takes us into the world of pointers, unsafe code, and topics such as the size of, fixed, sec, alloc, extern, and unsafe keywords. We will learn how to work with pointers, get a better understanding of the int and uint types, and even try importing a function written in C into our code. There is only one problem. There are no good real-world examples of where to use all of this, or at least some made-up exercises to practice it. As a C++ programmer, everything here was clear and easy for me to understand. Level 47, Other Language Features. The author says this is the last theoretical chapter, and it brings together all the smaller topics that didn't fit anywhere else in the book. It starts with the yield statement and iterator methods. The author tries to explain what they are, but for me this was a difficult concept to understand because it introduces a unique program behavior that I had never encountered before. Honestly, the author's explanation just wasn't enough for me. Next comes constants. It's surprising that the author hadn't mentioned them even once before this point, but he explained them well. After that, the chapter covers attributes and reflection. Both topics are interesting, but the explanations are quite short. I'd also like to add that attributes and reflection are commonly used in the Unity engine. The name of operator is also covered very briefly. The author gave a good example of how to use it, but I'd like to add that it's also useful when you need to pass method names to other methods. Instead of using a string where it's easy to make a typo, you can use name of. There is also a short discussion about nested types. Another small section covers the private, protected, and protected internal access modifiers. What a crazy feature. The next topic is bit manipulation. I've been reading programming books for a long time, so I was surprised that the author hadn't talked about this earlier. Most authors introduce bitwise operations and operators in the first few chapters. Here, though, the coverage is pretty superficial. Other authors usually explain this topic much better. The author also explains what the using block does, and why you should implement the iDisposable interface. The chapter also covers preprocessor directives, although probably not all of them. So I would sum it up like this. This chapter is full of interesting topics, and each one of them could have had several exercises and a much more detailed explanation, but the author chose not to do that. Level 48, Beyond a Single Project. In this chapter, we learn how to work with multiple projects at the same time. For example, we get a basic understanding of the difference between DLL and exe files, and we learn how to reference different libraries in our projects, including NuGet packages. This is a useful and even enjoyable topic, especially since the chapter comes with practical exercises. Level 49, Compiling in Depth. In this chapter, the author explains how a computer actually works, what a real instruction for adding two numbers looks like, what assembly language does with those instructions, why compilers were created, what the CLR is, why it exists, and what it does. The chapter also covers CIL, VBCL again, and the entire process of turning C# code into machine instructions. You will also learn about the most common architectures such as ARM and x86-64. However, I wish the author had also shown how to select a target architecture in Visual Studio so that readers could actually apply this knowledge in practice later on. Level 50, .NET. This is probably one of the most important chapters in the book, if not the most important. Besides explaining what the .NET platform is, what it includes, and how all of its components work together, the chapter introduces the different frameworks you can use to build various types of C# applications, web applications with ASP.NET, games with Unity, mobile apps with Xamarin, desktop applications with UWP, and more. However, the author missed one very important point. After finishing this book, you can choose one or more of these areas and start learning them using the C# language you've just mastered. In other words, this chapter answers the question, what should I do after I finish the book? Level 51, Publishing. In this chapter, the author explains how to choose the target architecture and build configuration in Visual Studio, as well as how to use the published feature to create finished applications that can be deployed to different platforms. There's nothing particularly difficult here, but it's a pretty interesting topic for anyone who wants to share their programs with other people and run them on different computers without any hassle. Level 52, the Final Battle. And here we are, the best chapter in the entire book. In this chapter, you will build a fairly large game using a huge amount of knowledge you've gained throughout the book. There are about 18 exercises in total, and each one makes the game bigger, more polished, and more interesting. I really wish the previous chapters had included at least half as many exercises, but I'm still glad this chapter exists. I found the task genuinely enjoyable and just challenging enough. The thing is, if the author had taken the time to come up with at least 5-10 exercises for each of the earlier chapters, where it made sense, of course, readers would have been much better prepared by the time they reached this final project. Level 53. Into Lands Uncharted. This farewell chapter is filled with advice and encouragement about what to do after finishing the book. Keep learning, keep building, keep experimenting, keep fixing your mistakes, and enjoy the process of overcoming challenges. There really isn't much else to add, although there are still 3 bonus levels left, and I'll talk about these next. Appendix A, Visual Studio. This chapter gives a basic overview of Visual Studio, explaining the different windows it has, how to work with them, how to use keyboard, shortcuts, IntelliSense, quick actions, and other built-in features. I'd actually recommend reading this short chapter twice. First at the beginning of the book, right after installing Visual Studio, and then again at the end to see how many of these features you actually ended up using. Appendix B, Compiler Errors. This chapter shows you many different compilation errors and gives you plenty of advice on how to analyze, understand, and fix them. Usually, this kind of knowledge simply comes with practice. If you completed the exercises in this book, you have most likely already encountered many errors and learned how to fix them on your own without even reading this chapter. However, if you still have trouble dealing with errors, you can read this chapter. Appendix C, Debugging Your Code. This chapter explains how to use the debugger in Visual Studio. It is an essential tool that I use quite often in programming, just like most other programmers, and I'm glad the author covered the basics. How to start the debugger, how to set breakpoints, how to step through code line by line, how to skip over parts of the code, and many other things. However, this is practical material, and it is much easier to explain visually, which is quite difficult to do in a book. So it would probably be better to look for some debugger tutorials somewhere else. Now it's time to summarize everything. As you heard, I have a lot of complaints about this book. Many topics are not explained deeply enough and are covered only on a surface level. A lot of topics also lack practical examples. However, the book is very easy to read in almost every chapter. The author never lied or exaggerated anything. All the information is accurate and still up to date, even though the book is already several years old. The book also contains a lot of exercises overall, and that is enough for beginners. I recommend this book to anyone who has never worked with C# before. So far, I haven't found a better C# book, but that's mainly because this is the first one I've read. Make sure to complete all the exercises in this book. The biggest value comes from solving the tasks, not from reading the theory. The author covered most of the topics that a junior C# developer needs to know. I will continue reading more C# books. I still have 2 more to read. I hope they will be at least on the same level and will also teach me something new. I also want to mention that on the official website of this book, the author said that he plans to release the 6th edition in 2026 with a lot of additional material. However, most of the content from this edition will most likely remain relevant, so I'm not going to wait for the 6th edition. I need to keep moving forward. Thank you for watching my review. If you found it interesting or useful, you can support me by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing to the channel, becoming a channel member, or donating through the link in the description. All of these things help promote the channel and motivate me to keep making videos for you. Have a great time learning, and goodbye!